East Asia on the Edge, Japan, China, and the battle for Southeast Asia's soul. My name is Palitha Thenawara, also known as Ken. I began living and working in Japan in 1989, became fluent in Japanese, and built my career with a U.S. IT company in Tokyo. In 1993, I was transferred to the company's San Francisco head office, before returning to Japan in 1997 and continuing to follow Japanese politics and society closely. From 2011, my work brought me to Vietnam through various technology project implementations across the region, and I have been calling Vietnam home since 2012, giving me a ground-level perspective on Southeast Asia that complements my decades of experience in Japan. It is precisely this combination, over 3 decades of living and working across Japan, the United States, and Southeast Asia, that shapes the analysis on this channel. I have watched Japanese politics evolve since 1989, and I understand how its government thinks and operates from the inside, which is why I find the current direction of Japanese foreign policy deeply concerning. Rather than escalating tensions with China through military posturing and alignment with Western strategic interests, Japan should be pursuing dialogue, reconciliation, and a pragmatic reset of its most important bilateral relationship. The reality of Taiwan's status, the limits of American military guarantees as demonstrated in the Middle East, and the sheer economic weight of China in this region all point to the same conclusion. Japan, and indeed all of Southeast Asia, would be far better served by building bridges with Beijing than by doubling down on a Western alliance that may not deliver when it is needed most. Something significant shifted in East Asia in November 2025, and its ripple effects are still being felt across the entire Indo-Pacific today. When Japanese Prime Minister Sanae, Takaichi stood before Parliament and stated that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan, a specific legal phrase that could permit the deployment of Japan's self-defense forces. She became the first Japanese leader in office to explicitly link a Taiwan crisis to Japan's direct security interests. China's reaction was swift and severe. What followed has been described by analysts as one of the sharpest deteriorations in Japan-China relations in modern history, and the consequences extend far beyond these two countries. They are now reshaping the strategic calculations of every nation in Southeast Asia. This is the story of how East Asia arrived at this dangerous new moment, what it means for the region, and how Southeast Asian nations are navigating one of the most complex balancing acts in their history. How the crisis unfolded relations between China and Japan entered a state of crisis in November 2025, after Prime Minister Takaichi's parliamentary remarks on Taiwan. Following her statement, the Chinese Consul General in Osaka made threatening comments against Takaichi on social media, triggering a full diplomatic row between the two countries. Rather than de-escalating, both sides doubled down. Since the beginning of 2026, both sides have engaged in a series of tit-for-tat measures. In January, China's Ministry of Commerce announced tighter export controls on dual-use items to Japan. In February, it added 20 Japanese entities to its export control list and placed another 20 on a watch list. Then came a development that added a deeply personal dimension to the crisis. In March 2026, a Japanese self-defense forces officer broke into the Chinese embassy in Tokyo carrying a knife. Japan called the incident regrettable and increased security, but China demanded severe punishment, arguing that Tokyo's response was wholly insufficient. The diplomatic language followed the actions. Japan's 2026 Diplomatic Blue Book, released in April, downgraded China's status from one of the most important neighboring countries to simply an important neighbor, a subtle but symbolically significant demotion. What began as a diplomatic spat over Taiwan is spiraling into something structural. The two Asian powers are edging away from coexistence in a rules-based regional order and towards strategic competition punctuated by periodic crises. European Council on Foreign Relations. The military dimension. The deterioration is not just diplomatic, it has a sharp military edge. In March 2026, Japan deployed its first upgraded Type 12 land-to-ship missiles, with a range of approximately 1,000 kilometers, giving it a standoff capability that could potentially reach mainland China. Beijing is particularly concerned about Japan's plans to deploy missiles on Yonaguni, Japan's westernmost island, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan. Beijing has strengthened its naval operations in the East China Sea, while Tokyo has committed to boosting its defense budget to reach 2% of GDP by 2027. The United States has deepened its military exercises with Japan, a posture that Beijing views as a form of strategic encirclement. Japan's government has already decided to review its national security strategy and defense plan in 2026. Economic security measures are also being put in place that will restrict Chinese investment in Japanese land and real estate, a trend likely to accelerate, and Japan's appetite for economic interdependence with China is diminishing by the month. What we are witnessing is not a temporary dispute. It is a structural realignment. The economic fallout. Wars are not only fought with weapons. The economic consequences of this diplomatic breakdown are already being felt in both countries. Tourism has been the sector most rapidly affected. China issued a warning advising its citizens to avoid traveling to Japan, leading to widespread flight cancellations and significant declines in connections between the two countries. Japanese companies now rank political risk in their China relations as a primary concern for 2026. For two economies as deeply intertwined as Japan and China, this decoupling carries real costs on both sides. But the direction of travel is clear. Both governments are quietly preparing for a future of reduced economic interdependence, even if neither is willing to say so publicly. Southeast Asia, caught in the middle here, is where the story becomes even more complex and where the stakes extend to over 600 million people across Southeast Asia. China remains ASEAN's leading trading partner, with bilateral trade reaching US $950 billion in 2025. Japan, meanwhile, maintains its position as a major investor in Southeast Asian infrastructure and manufacturing, with significant projects across Vietnam and Indonesia. These two economic giants are simultaneously Southeast Asia's most important partners and its biggest geopolitical headache. The State of Southeast Asia 2026 survey reveals that the region continues to feel uneasy about China's entrenched influence, while also growing increasingly troubled by U.S. leadership under President Trump. U.S. leadership now ranks as the region's top geopolitical concern at 51.9%, overtaking even the South China Sea dispute. In contrast to the volatility that increasingly defines U.S. engagement with the region, China's approach toward ASEAN in 2026 is characterized by continuity, predictability, and long-horizon planning, anchored in formal planning cycles, institutionalized economic agreements, and sustained diplomatic engagement. For Southeast Asian nations, this creates a genuine dilemma. The U.S. and Japan expect solidarity. China offers economic depth and reliability, and ASEAN's foundational principle, unity through neutrality, is being tested as never before. The strategic question in Southeast Asian boardrooms has evolved. It is no longer, how do we avoid taking sides, but how do we benefit from all sides? ASEAN member states have broadened their strategic portfolio by signing comprehensive partnerships with Japan, Australia, India, and South Korea, generating over $200 billion in new investment commitments. Some ASEAN member countries lean more closely towards China, whereas others, such as the Philippines and Singapore, tend to align more closely with the U.S. Under the Philippines' 2026 ASEAN chairmanship, maintaining unity across these diverging positions is the central challenge. Where does this end? There are no easy answers here. What we can say is this: the Japan-China crisis is no longer just a bilateral dispute. It has become a test case for the entire regional order. for whether Asia can manage great power competition without it spilling into open conflict, and for whether Southeast Asia can maintain its strategic autonomy in an era that increasingly demands sides be chosen. The crisis stems from a structural tension between China's ideological framework, which centers Taiwan in its national identity and regime, legitimacy, and Japan's strategic perception that directly links a Taiwan scenario to its own national security. Those two positions are not easily reconciled. What is clear is that Southeast Asia's best path forward lies not in choosing between Beijing and Tokyo, but in doing what it has always done best, maintaining relationships with all, committing to none, and extracting maximum benefit from its position at the crossroads of the world's most consequential rivalry. Whether that strategy remains sustainable in the years ahead is the defining question of Asian geopolitics in our time. Thanks for watching. Voice is AI generated. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and click the like button if you like my presentation. Palitha Thenuwara.